Hello, I'm Professor Lori Rudman, and this is Lecture 1 for the Psychology of Sex and Gender. Welcome to the course. I'm going to introduce you to it today, and then I'll provide a brief history of gender research within social psychology. The course format is asynchronous with an option for mixed, and I'll explain what I mean by that. All lectures and films are online to accommodate students who need less structure during the COVID crisis, so you can watch them on your own time. And on Wednesdays, I'll send out a link to meet on Zoom because much of the benefit of taking the course comes from learning about what your peers discovered by doing the assignments, which we will share on Wednesday. We can also discuss any questions that arise from the readings and lectures. But don't worry, these meetings are optional, so if you can't make it, it won't affect your grade in any way. So what are we going to do in the course? We'll examine social psychological theories and research on how gender shapes identity and social interactions across multiple domains. Here's an overview of the topics that we'll be covering and the assignments that you will be producing to help you decide if you want to stay enrolled. Topics include nature versus nurture. Do gender differences come primarily from biology or primarily from how we are socialized? Gender similarities is a theme that I'm going to hit early and often because we often think of men and women as coming from two different planets, Mars versus Venus, in the old chestnut that John Gray sells with his popularized books. And what you're going to learn is that we're largely the same. Ambivalent gender attitudes are covered. Where do they come from? You've probably heard the saying, can't live with them, can't live without them when it comes to the other gender. Well, how do we get to that point when we think about the other gender ambivalently, both loving them and having trouble with them? It comes from our childhood, as we'll see. What about gender stereotypes? We'll talk about where they come from and, importantly, what their function is. I'll even touch on that a little bit today. We'll talk about gender conformity and backlash against nonconformists, who I call gender vanguards. If you've taken a sociology course in gender, they often call them gender deviants. But deviants kind of sounds like criminals, so I prefer to call them gender vanguards or trailblazers. In fact, your first assignment is central to this topic, so I'll help you with that today as well. Work-family conflict, it's no longer just affecting women, the strain on our lives when we have a professional career and at the same time we're trying to raise a family. Nowadays, men also are experiencing work-family conflict, so we'll talk about that. Some of my favorite topics, love, romance, and sex, we will cover, as well as masculinity pressures and how the pressure on men to be masculine can lead to aggression. So something about me, why do I study gender? I've been researching it since the early 1990s. I got my PhD in 1995 at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And while it wasn't my first choice, it has proven to be my passion. Why? Because it's one of the most exciting topics that can be scientifically studied. Not only does it constantly yield surprises, making the work challenging and engaging, but it also informs social justice issues and has the potential to make the world a better place for everyone, regardless of their gender. After all, understanding the other gender is crucial for our happiness and close relationships if we're heterosexual. Therefore, it's crucial for our health and well-being. People in happy unions live longer, even after controlling for factors like smoking, body weight, chronic diseases, drug abuse, etc., etc. So learning about how women and men interact and what they desire and expect from one another will improve your life. So how are you evaluated in this course? Students always want to know that off the top. There's no exams, so that's the good news. Instead, your grades are based entirely on 9 written assignments, including a final paper. For 8 Wednesdays, you will complete an exercise and submit it through Canvas at least by class time, which is 5 p.m. Early papers are welcome. I'm going to stress that later on. So if you want to get a high score on your assignments, I assume you do, what you need to do is show me in your papers that you have learned something from watching the lecture and doing the assigned readings, right? You're just going to synthesize what I've been trying to teach you into that week's assignment. And that's vital to know, because that's the only way I know that you're keeping up with the readings and lectures is if you synthesize what you've learned into your written essays. And if you practice that skill 8 times, that's going to set you up to ace the final paper. I promise you, there's a method to my madness here. The URL for each lecture is listed on your syllabus, which is, of course, posted on Canvas. And you can also access all your assignments and readings on Canvas right off the top. And that includes a free PDF of your text, which is The Social Psychology of Gender, How Power and Intimacy Shape Gender Relations, written by myself and my often frequent research collaborator, Peter Glick. My advice to you is while you can work at your own pace, I recommend you follow the syllabus so that the material is fresh in your mind when you complete the scheduled assignment. Therefore, check that syllabus often for when your assignments are due, and check email for Zoom links. I'll send it out on Tuesdays if you can make Wednesday meetings. Again, Wednesday meetings are optional. You can think of it as office hours if that helps you to realize, oh, I don't really have to do this, right? I just find, as I've taught this course several times, that students get more out of it if they can show up at least once in a while to Zoom meetings, because there's interaction between yourselves in terms of what you learned that week. Regardless, email me 24/7, 7 days a week, for any reason at all. I promise to respond quickly. The outside readings are scientific journal articles where the statistics can be quite confusing. So do what I did when I was an undergrad. Just ignore the results section and concentrate on the intro, the methods, and the discussion, which are written in English. For journal articles listed as optional, that means I'll cover the content pretty thoroughly in lecture, but I also wanted to give you the option to read it for yourself, because some of you are aimed for graduate school, and it's a really good practice for grad school to read scientific journal articles. What is the final project? You're going to choose a book to analyze in a paper that will deepen your understanding of some aspect of gender via independent reading. It's about 6 to 10 pages long. There's a lot of details in your syllabus about it. The goal is to integrate some of the key constructs you learned in a quasi or glorified book report. In other words, it's the same thing you will have been doing with your 8 other assignments. It's just it's going to be slightly longer, and you will be reading an outside book in order to synthesize what you've learned into your review of that book. So I've given you a list of texts that students have liked in the past, and throughout some of the lectures I kind of highlight some of those texts to give you a sense of what's in store for you if you pick that particular book to read. So I put that list under assignments on Canvas. It's the same link that you'll use to submit your final paper. I think it just says suggested text for final paper. And please, you are more than welcome to pick another book. Read something that's not on the list. But I think it's a wise idea to clear it with me first, because not every book will lend itself to the objectives of the final paper. You know, you might want to pick up a novel of, Japanese women in some certain time period, but I'm not so sure that that's going to help you, that kind of material will link up to some of the things main constructs that we've talked about in the course. So that's why I asked you to clear it with me first. There are 8 written assignments found on Canvas under assignments, and they all involve writing a 2-page, no more than 3-page essay. I need you to submit it by class time, the Wednesday it's due, and have it handy so you can share your thoughts with all of us on Zoom if you can make it to the Zoom meetings. Regardless of whether you're attending Zoom meetings, I need you to turn the paper in by 5 p.m. on the Wednesday that it's due. Check your syllabus for the exact date. Early submissions are hugely encouraged because if I get a sense of, what people have been writing about, then it helps me during the office hours Zoom meeting. And always, if you need extra time, let me know in advance. Otherwise, I just lop off half the points if you submit it without letting me know why you're late. But I try to be flexible, so just let me know what's going on in your life. So the assignments start out next Wednesday. The first one is to interview someone in a non-traditional gender role, that is a gender vanguard. For example, a male nurse, a female cop, a woman in the military, a woman in ROTC, a man who takes care of the kids at home because his wife is the primary breadwinner, that kind of thing. And report on their challenges and rewards. Reflect on your own experiences. I'm going to give you a lot more. Wow, I hope that didn't come through. That was a loud noise. Reflect on the second, and I'm going to give you a lot more information about the first assignment in a minute. The second assignment is to reflect on your own experiences with gender segregation as a child, or lots of people don't have very good memories, called childhood amnesia. Or you can visit an online store or a physical store to analyze how products for boys and girls differ, products like toys or clothes, books, videos, what have you, and then how they are segregated in stores. The third assignment is to analyze how the media perpetuates gender stereotypes using any medium such as advertising, music, TV shows, film, and I assign a film called Misrepresentation that will help you a lot with this assignment. The next assignment is to perform a mild gender transgression and report on how you felt or how others reacted to it. Or especially in the time of COVID, it's hard to be interacting with strangers and wearing masks and things like that. You can describe a time when you transgressed gender bounds in the past, or if you don't want to talk about that, it's too personal, or maybe you've never done it, you can talk about when someone you know or someone you witnessed transgressed gender bounds in the past. In fact, you can even pick out a novel that you read where somebody in the novel transgressed gender bounds in the past. There's just lots of different ways to do this assignment as the Word doc that describes it outlines and details. But the idea is to get a sense of what gender vanguards are up against, right? Analyze online personal ads for romance. That's another assignment, to find out whether men and women shop for different qualities in a mate and sell themselves as a potential mate by different or similar means. There's quite a lot of gender stereotyping in romance ads, personal ads as they're called. So students find this assignment quite illuminating. Interview a man and a woman, at least one man and at least one woman, about their definition of feminism, comparing their responses to each other and to your own ideas about whether you identify as a feminist or not. Another assignment is to decide which gender bears most of the blame for the sexual double standard and defend your position. The sexual double standard is just what social psychologists call the fact that men are allowed in our society to have a great deal more sexual experience, more sexual partners than women are. So there's a double standard for sexual experience. So why is that? Are men more responsible for that state of affairs, or are women? And this assignment involves reacting to a provocative paper by Roy Baumeister and Jean Twenge, which is available, obviously, on Canvas for you to read. Now, it's a long paper, so I warn you to start reading it a lot earlier than even a week before the assignment is due. You're going to decide whether Baumeister and Twenge are right or wrong in their firm conclusion that it's women who are to blame for the sexual double standard, not men. They completely exonerate men. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why or why not? And then the last short assignment is to analyze male aggression in the media using any format you wish, like sports, rap music, film, video games, you name it, and how it promotes men as violence objects. And we'll learn more about what I mean by that. But so much of the social psychological research has focused on women as sexual objects, and not any research has focused on men as violence objects, which is just something you're going to see a lot when you start looking for it. You can start today in media that you watch. You'll notice that men are routinely shot, butchered, slayed, exterminated, and nobody sheds a tear. We cry more when dogs are killed in movies than when many, many men are shot up and killed in films. So what's going on with that? So we're going to dive into that because I think it's really an investigated, certainly not investigated, so it's a completely ignored topic in gender research, and I love to get my students' reactions to the assignment because it's helping me decide how I'm going to go forward and do research on the topic. Every one of these assignments is explained in a separate Word doc on Canvas, and the very first one, but only the first one, gives you ideas for which course concepts you might integrate. Specifically, I talk about social role theory and gender essentialism, and those are described in Lecture 2. From then on in, you're on your own to try to figure out which of the concepts you learned about you can weave into your essay for that week. So why don't I give you more clues? Because that's not very much fun for you if I tell you what I'm looking for. And believe me, I get all kinds of different ideas that people come up with when they write these assignments, and that makes it more interesting for me to read and for the class to discuss during Wednesdays on Zoom. Now, you don't have to come up with different concepts for every single essay. There's quite a lot of essays where social role theory and or gender essentialism could be something that you mention or talk about or link up to. But don't just rely on talking about gender stereotypes over and over again, right? I'll let you know if I think you're going off in that direction by giving you comments on Canvas. I'm just kind of giving you a heads up early about that. So the mechanics for every paper, I really want you to do the APA formatting. It's the only thing I want you to do that's in lockstep with APA, meaning the American Psychological Association's guidelines for written material. Double-spaced, Times New Roman is the font, 12 point. So if you have questions so far while you are listening to this, watching this, go ahead and jot them down so you can email them to me later. Because right now I want to prepare you for your first essay due next Wednesday on January 26th by 5 p.m. It's the gender role exercise. So, thanks to gender stereotypes, it can be hard for people to occupy roles traditionally associated with the other gender. However, it can also be highly rewarding because people like to do what they're good at, even if it's unconventional. Gender vanguards are people who cross gender bounds and in so doing pave the way for others to join them. Such trailblazers are critical for challenging gender stereotypes, which is the only way we're going to defeat those stereotypes and eliminate their power. Did you know blacks were once thought to be so physically weak that they were banned from professional sports and the Olympics? Now they're viewed as naturally athletic. Women were once judged to be too emotional for higher ed, so they were barred from college. Now, 57% of college students are female, and they graduate at higher rates than men. It took courageous vanguards to bust down the stereotypes and clear the way, so we need more of them. Your task is to interview a vanguard using the guidelines written up in your assignment. To qualify as a vanguard, people just have to be engaged in something atypical for their gender. Usually it's a job, but it doesn't have to be a job. For example, stay-at-home dads are great subjects, or women, even if they work in a female-dominated job, as long as they make more money than their husband, that's still the minority of women. I think the last time I looked, it was about 28% of wives made more money than their women, so they're still in the minority. So women who make more money than their husbands also qualify as gender vanguards. Frequently asked questions. Can you interview someone you know? Oh, yes. As long as you feel you can ask someone personal questions and they feel comfortable being honest with you. So it depends on your relationship. Do you have to agree with their life choice? No. You can be either supportive or skeptical, and either way, you'll get insight into their life. Do I have to follow the questions provided? Nope. Make up your own. Do I have to type up the interview as it occurred like a stenographer? You can. I'd rather you not. It's really best that you summarize what you learn, weaving in what you gleaned from lecture 2, for example, social role theory and gender essentialism. So ideas people have used in the past: male nurses, elementary school teachers that are male, these are all men. Librarians, most librarians are still women. Male dancers, stay-at-home dads, as I already said. In short, any man who occupies a female-typed role. And for women, women who are executives, doctors, lawyers, scientists, police officers, women in the military, or, as I said, wives who make more money than their husbands. Any woman who occupies a male-typed role. Last semester, I had a male student who decided to become a nurse after interviewing a man who absolutely loves doing that job. He found out it doesn't take nearly as much time to become a nurse as a doctor, so you're not shelling out money for student loans for much of your adult life afterwards. And the guy just raved about his job. And so the student said, I'm going to do that. And I thought that was pretty neat. If you don't know a vanguard, you might check Reddit. I had a woman who found a female butcher that way using Reddit, and the result was just a terrific interview. A female butcher. Now that's a woman who's doing a job that's typically associated with men. So if you have questions, like maybe you already have somebody in mind, if so, if you're unsure whether she or he is a vanguard and you can't make it to class on Zoom, email me your idea as soon as possible so you can get going on that assignment. Oh, and please note, mothers who work are actually the majority, right, of women in our country are working moms. So they aren't trailblazers just by nature of the fact that they're working moms. They have to also occupy a male-dominated role. Okay, so now my job is to give you a brief history of gender research, which I've called the evolution of approach to gender research within social psychology. In the beginning, I mean way in the beginning, social psych was built on the ashes of World War II by Jewish social scientists who escaped Nazi Germany to come to the United States. When they got here, they naturally wanted to study prejudice, starting with anti-Semitism, which is prejudice against Jews. They were just flummoxed. They said, you know, we're here now, we're safe, but now we want to figure out how it is that Jews and German Christians lived together for decades, forever, harmoniously, and then all of a sudden they want to exterminate us. What's going on with that? So they started out with anti-Semitism, but by the 1950s they had expanded to include prejudices based on race, ethnicity, your country of origin, and class, but not gender. Gordon Allport kicked off The Nature of Prejudice in 1954 with a book by that title. It's a seminal book in social psychology, The Nature of Prejudice. And here's what he said about gender. He wrote that misogynists viewed women as their inferiors. Misogynists are women haters. But he characterized them as rare, stating that for many people, this so-called war of the sexes seems totally unreal. They do not find in it a ground for prejudice. So he wrote that early in his book on page 34, and that was it. He didn't come back to it. Even though he listed official forms of discrimination as recognized by the United Nations as follows: inequality in access to public office, the enjoyment of free choice of employment, you can have whatever job you want, and the regulation and treatment of ownership, the ability to run for public office, have the job you want, and to own anything you like. He writes that, and yet he failed to notice how those criteria readily applied to women in 1954. Half the population. Women are half the population. How do you miss it? Unequal access to public office. Women today are just a quarter of Congress, but that's better than in the 1950s when there were no female lawmakers. As for free choice in employment, back then, the newspaper want ads were wholly segregated by gender. A woman could not even apply for a job in the men's section. Regulation of ownership. Women were not allowed to have credit, so they couldn't buy property. Any house or cars or appliances in the home were in the husband's name. He owned all of it. How could Allport have missed gender prejudice? In many ways, he's a genius, but he was blind to sexism. Of course, so did every other male scientist miss sexism back then, perhaps because the word sexism wasn't coined until the mid-1970s. Before the women's movement, what we call the second wave of the women's movement, it was just called life. Women just swam in a sea of sexism and nobody had a name for it. As we'll see, it took a female social scientist to start gender research in 1972. But there's another reason why Allport might have missed the obvious. It's because the way he defined prejudice as an antipathy based upon a faulty or inflexible generalization, translation, a hostility based on negative stereotypes. However, this definition does not fully capture gender prejudice, which is often paternalistic, and the name that we have for that is benevolent sexism. And so, while Allport downplayed the hostile sexism that did and does exist, he was ill-equipped with this definition to see sexism's complexities and therefore its prevalence. So let's start over. Take two. In the beginning, gender prejudice research began serendipitously with a cocktail party and a New Yorker cartoon. Janet Spence met Robert Helmreich at a party in New York, and both were struck by a cartoon in which a man said to his dinner date, "You are really stupid. I like that in a woman." It was a New Yorker cartoon. So he's sitting at the table with his dinner date, and he says to her, "You are really stupid. I like that in a woman." So this cartoon gave them a research idea. Robert had recently found that competent men were liked more than incompetent men, and Janet wondered whether the effect would be reversed for women. Would people like incompetent women more, as the cartoon would suggest? The result was their seminal study, Who Likes Competent Women?, which was published in 1972. In order to find out who likes competent women, they had to design the very first measure of sexism, and they called it the Attitudes Towards Women scale. Here are sample items from the Attitudes Towards Women scale. In general, the father should have greater authority than the mother in the bringing up of the children, and people responded to that on like a 1 to a 7-point scale, with strongly disagree being 1, strongly agree being 7. I'm sure you've seen those scales. Often they're called Likert scales. Another item, sons in the family should be given more encouragement to go to college than daughters. A third item, a woman should not expect to go to the same places or to have the same freedom as a man. Another item is swearing and obscenity are more repulsive in the speech of a woman than a man. There were, I think they started out with something like 30 items. And the results showed that, as they predicted, only people who scored low on the attitudes towards women scale would like competent women, and that's what they found. Okay, people who scored high on the attitudes towards women scale liked incompetent women more than competent women, vice versa for people who scored low. Now, in so doing, they effectively launched gender research in my field, and dozens of studies used the AWS until it became outdated in the 1980s. Oh, why did it? It became outdated in the 1980s because participants would just start circling 1 all the way down on each item. Strongly disagree, strongly disagree, strongly disagree, right? The items were too blatantly sexist for people to agree with them by the late 1980s. So besides attitudes towards women, researchers have also investigated gender stereotypes, which have, unlike attitudes towards women, remained stable over time. So here they are in a nutshell. Men are viewed as more ambitious, dominant, rational, competent, powerful, able, compared with women. In a word, men are seen as more agentic. Now, that's a word you won't find in the English dictionary. The closest you come to it is agency. But in psychology, in a psychological dictionary, you would find it, and it means like self-motivating, self-reliant, independent, and self-propelling. Okay, so men are more ambitious, dominant, rational, competent, powerful, able, in a word, agentic. How are women perceived? They are seen as more supportive, loving, kind, sensitive to others, helpful, nice. In a word that you will find in the English dictionary, communal. So men are thought to be sort of self-oriented, and women are thought to be sort of other-oriented, right? Agentic, self-oriented, communal, other-oriented. That's one way to think about it. Notice how these male stereotypes map onto career orientation and leadership qualities, whereas female stereotypes map onto motherhood. No wonder men are viewed as more fit for high-status jobs, right? They're stereotyped as being more fit for leadership roles. The solution, therefore, seemed simple. To combat gender stereotypes, women just need to act like men. They need to be more agentic, right? More ambitious, more self-promoting, demonstrate their ability in a sort of a showy way. And then that would solve sexism in the workplace. People would stop stereotyping men and women differently. But hang on, not so fast. What happened instead, and I was instrumental in starting the discovery of this, was the discovery of backlash, which is prejudice against agentic women. It turns out people don't like women who act like leaders, meaning who act like men. So that led researchers to conclude that there's actually 2 types of stereotypes. There's descriptive and prescriptive. And you'll see that male agency is a prescriptive stereotype, and that's why women get into trouble if they act too agentic. Okay, but I don't want to get too far ahead. So what's the difference between descriptive and prescriptive stereotypes? Descriptive stereotypes describe how men and women typically are. Atypical men and women may raise eyebrows, but not hackles. People don't get upset if you are breaking a descriptive stereotype. Examples: men are taller, but tall women are not shunned, and tall women who are models are absolutely glorified, right? Women do live longer, than men, but men who live to be 100 or more are just as celebrated as super senior women. Whereas prescriptive stereotypes prescribe, just the way a pharmacist prescribes medication, how men and women should be. These are gender rules that, if you violate them, you can get into trouble. You are at risk for harsh social penalties. For example, men should be brave. So a man who cowers behind his girlfriend when a dog snarls at a couple, that man is ridiculed. Also, women should not dominate men, so female leaders risk backlash. Gender, it turns out, compared with other social groups, is uniquely prescriptive. It turns out there's lots of rules for men and women, and they're stricter for gender than other social categories such as race and nationality. Examples: blacks are stereotyped as more athletic than whites. Remember, they used to be stereotyped as too weak to be professional athletes or to compete in the Olympics, and now that stereotype has done a 180, right? But even despite the fact that blacks are stereotyped as more athletic than whites, non-athletic blacks are not spurned, and athletic whites are just as celebrated. So it's not a rule that blacks must be more athletic than whites. Asian Americans, stereotyped as scientifically gifted, but any Asian Americans who just like math and science are not ostracized, and gifted non-Asians are welcomed with open arms. Or ethnicity, think about Norwegians. They're stereotyped as terrific skiers, but let's say you meet one who says, frankly, I hate to ski, nobody in the room gets upset. Why? Why not? Norwegians are stereotyped as great skiers, but a non-skiing Norwegian is completely fine. So what's going on here? The reason why not, because none of these stereotypes have strong or any implications for social hierarchies. By contrast, gender rules reinforce patriarchy or male dominance by explaining why men have more power than women. For example, men are braver and bolder, whereas women are weaker and meeker, which justifies the gender hierarchy. Okay, so if you break a prescriptive gender rule that supports the gender hierarchy, that's when the social trouble comes in. That's when you risk backlash because you're challenging something that people view as very important. Male dominance, patriarchy. In other words, strong women and weak men risk backlash because they challenge patriarchy. If women are men's equals in brains, bravery, leadership skills, etc., there becomes no legitimate reason for men having greater status and power. It just wipes out the justification. Backlash for stepping out of gender bounds reveals that the remedy for sex discrimination is not straightforward. Women cannot just act like men to get ahead. So this is kind of a preview of what we're going to learn about more in depth when we study backlash and the research that supports it. But I'll just mention in this first lecture that I've been studying backlash since the early 90s, and it wasn't until 2012 that I found evidence that the motivation for it is to reinforce patriarchy. So you'll be learning about that. But it just tells you how challenging it is to do this kind of work, that it took me all that time. Just think about all, decades before I finally landed on what the real motive was for backlash against agentic women and backlash against communal men. They challenge the gender hierarchy, and people don't want that hierarchy challenged. So they ostracize men and women who pierce it. Here's a recent example. Once Joe Biden selected Kamala Harris as his running mate, she faced backlash. On the left, they said, oh, she's too ambitious. She's not going to be a team player in Joe Biden's administration. And on the right, they said, oh, she's too nasty. And as you'll learn, it actually means the same thing. She's too agentic. And she's not alone. As we'll learn in the course, female politicians and business leaders face backlash because there's this double standard for agency. It's not only acceptable for men to be agentic, ambitious, self-promoting, aggressive, it's actually prescribed for men to be that way, right? But not for women. So therefore, a double standard just means what's good for the gander is not necessarily good for the goose, and vice versa, right? What one gender is expected to be or can get away with being, not necessarily so for the other gender. And agency, which is so important for getting ahead in life, that it deeply handicaps women, this particular double standard. And that brings me full circle back to a New Yorker cartoon. What's the difference between being assertive and being aggressive? Answer, your gender. Agentic men are seen as assertive, but agentic women are viewed as aggressive, even when they display the exact same behaviors. And how do we know that? We know that from social science research, much of it conducted by myself, but not only myself. So this cartoon actually turns out to be a scientific fact. Questions or comments? I kind of threw a lot at you today to give you a preview, but like I say, I want you to get a sense of whether you want to hang in there with me for the rest of the semester, whether you are coming on Zoom to meet with me or not. So if you do have questions, comments, please email me if you can't attend the meetings on Zoom. Otherwise, if you can, I hope to see you soon.